Aha, there we go. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. Ooh, too loud. My bad. All right. Okay. Okay. Sorry. A little late getting in today because of the roads. Okay. So today we're gonna turn the lights down. That's the first thing I'm gonna do. And yes, I am live streaming. All good. Okay. So as expected, usually when the roads get really bad, attendance drops, and people are looking for the live stream, which is all good. That's why we have it. Okay, so today we're going to keep going talking about kind of concepts and theories. Specifically, we're going to look, like we finished off looking at Marxism on Wednesday, and Marxism and its kind of theory of capitalism and its theory of value, which again, like liberal economics and Adam Smith, both of them have a labor theory of value, meaning they think the value of a good comes out of the labor time that was spent making it. So we're going to move in today and talk about a slightly different theory of value, which is what you could call the subjective theory of value or the marginal theory of value, coming out of the Austrian School of Economics. Okay, so when we talk about kind of Marxist thought in general, we can kind of cluster people who disagree with Marxist thought and to some sense liberal classical economics into different categories. But when we talk about Marxist thought specifically, you can kind of class people into a couple of categories. So those who agree with Marx's kind of general critiques of capitalism, but disagree with communism, right? They don't want communism. And there's lots of these, right? Right through, from when Marx was writing all the way till today. And, if you want some kind of political curiosity, the person who just announced that he's running for the leadership of the Federal Liberal Party, Mark Carney, I would put Mark Carney, based on what he wrote in his book, in this category, right? I think he agrees principally with Marx's critiques of capitalism, but disagrees with the idea of communism. Okay, so he's definitely a redistributionist, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, so there are those also who disagree or agree with, the ideology of communism, but disagree on his view of economics, right? So they generally wouldn't agree with the sort of certain things like labor theory of value and other Marxist economic principles, but again, would be widely okay with kind of communal ownership and such things. And then probably the more kind of interesting category, and the one we'll spend a bunch of time today talking about, they disagree with both the ideology of communism and Marx's economic views. And here we find what's referred to, if you go over to the economics department, as a heterodox school of economics. So you can have either an orthodox view or a heterodox view. And if we think of something like neoliberal economics, that and Keynesian economics, those are considered kind of orthodox views of economics. Austrian economics is considered a kind of out there kind of view of economics. But it's an interesting one the early proponents of kind of the Austrian view are really interested in critiquing Marx especially, but as time goes on and you get people like Friedrich Hayek, they develop a sort of economic view of their own. Okay, so Austrian economics, we're going to talk a little bit about it today. They're pretty interesting fellows. So not for nothing, the founders of Austrian economics came from Austria. Okay. One of the big projects of Austrian economics is to discredit Marx's whole economic idea. And probably the most prominent figure here is Ludwig von Mises. Though Karl Menger also kind of works in this vein, but I think probably the definitive work on opposing Marxism from the Austrian perspective is from von Mises. Their whole idea is to undermine the whole ideological project by basically suggesting that Marx's economic views are wrong, and especially on labor, that he makes a critical mistake. And it's one, I think, that a lot of sociologists continue to make in adopting a labor theory of value. Okay, so their project is predicated on what they call methodological individualism. And this is the idea that any social phenomenon basically comes out of the motivations and actions of individuals. And so what you're interested in when you're talking about things like capitalism, prices, wages, how individual understandings of things ultimately shape those phenomena. Okay, so we talked about this last class, this idea in Marxism, in a sense borrowed from liberal economics, that profit is a kind of form of theft, right? Liberal economics wouldn't say it's theft, but definitely has the same view of labor and a labor theory of value on which this idea is based, right? So workers are paid less than the value they produce for their employer, right? So basically their employer is stealing that difference from the workers. If the workers owned the enterprise, they would profit completely from the creation of that extra value. So for Marxists, right, and Marx will say roughly this, there's little difference between chattel slavery, right, the form of slavery that was practiced in the Americas, right, where you owned the slave and you owned the value of their labor, and production under capitalism. Okay, but the Austrians are kind of the first to raise big objections to this premise. Okay, so the first thing, right, we put number one. The Marxist view is based on the assumption that it's possible to objectively and consistently judge the value of someone's labor, right? If you want to pay a worker exactly the value of what they create, how much is that, right? And how much is the profit going to be? You don't really know in advance, right? You might create a product, produce it, take it to market, and the thing completely flops. So you could end up with a situation where you are producing something that nobody wants, and so your surplus value would be zero. In fact, it would be negative because you've actually lost money because you probably already paid the wages. And this is part of the problem. It's hard to know, based on a labor theory of value, what that labor is worth. What determines the value of anything, right? Why is, say, an iPhone 16 worth $1,700 and a Pixel 7a is worth $300, right? What determines that value under capitalism? But what then, how can you value the labor that went into it? How do you value something as nebulous as labor? And this is the kind of question that the Austrians pose. Okay, and this comes to what is one of the classical problems of economics, and it's referred to as the diamond water paradox. And it's kind of a thought experiment, right? Basically, to try and figure out why things have particular value. And depending on how you answer the diamond water paradox, your view of kind of value the value of things, the value of labor changes. And the Austrians have a very particular way of answering it, right? And it's a very simple question, right? So, diamonds, right? They're incredibly valuable. They're worth a lot of money. They're really hard to get, but they're kind of useless, right? We use them for some industrial purposes, but for the most part, a lot of diamonds are for jewelry, right? They're really valuable, but in the grand scheme of things, they don't do much for us. Versus water, right? Water is essential for human life, right? If you don't drink water for a few days, you're going to die. And yet water is very cheap. So why is it that diamonds are expensive but useless and water is useful but cheap? Okay, so a Marxist, and even in some cases a classical economic or liberal economic kind of way of answering the diamond water paradox is to say, the value of a commodity or the quantity of another commodity for which it's exchanged depends on the relative quantity of labor required for its production. So what does that mean? Okay, so why are diamonds more expensive? Well, diamonds are hard to get, right? Diamonds are hard to get. So you have to put in a lot of labor to get a diamond, right? It takes more labor to produce a diamond, and therefore it is more expensive, right? Labor theory of value. Water, right? You can turn on the tap, or if you don't have a tap, you can go down to the well or the river and scoop up as much water as you can carry. So water is really easy to get, and so it is relatively cheap, right? So here, when De Beers, either you're buying it or someone is buying it for you. You can go down to the diamond shop and buy a big fat diamond for your honey, and you propose to them and whatever, right? All that excess profit that De Beers and the jewelry store make are ultimately theft in the Marxist view, because probably the person who mined that diamond didn't get the full value of the labor that they put in, okay? So hopefully that all makes sense so far. Now, the Austrian solution, and the Austrians ask a kind of interesting question about this. So Menger, Karl Menger, the first kind of Austrian thinker, and the one who kind of worked on refuting the labor theory of value. And thinking about the diamond water paradox, he came up with this very same kind of idea, adding, I think, that diamonds are rare, right? So rare equals value because there's less supply, and water is common, so lots of supply equals, cheap. But Menger kind of wants to complicate this a little bit. So he says, the most common answers to this diamond water paradox, and this is a question that's been around in economics since the 19th century, drew on Smith's idea of supply and demand or on the labor theory of value. But, there's too many exceptions to things like supply and demand, right? There's lots of moments where, again, something that exists in a lot of supply, right, like your iPhone, right, there's no shortage of iPhones, commands a really high price. So something like supply and demand doesn't always equate to why prices for certain things would be high. And, okay, the other part of the diamond water paradox, I just want to make sure I don't have it on the slide. Okay. There are certain circumstances that you can imagine where water starts to become more valuable than diamonds, right? Regardless of how much labor goes into it. So, and the thought experiment is always something like, you're in the desert, right? You have a bag of diamonds, right? That it took an enormous amount of labor for someone to collect, and you have this huge bag of diamonds, but you're dying of thirst. And someone comes to you with a glass of water that they scooped out of wherever that didn't require a lot of labor to get, how many diamonds would you pay for that glass of water if you're dying of thirst, right? And the answer is, well, probably a lot, right? In that case, regardless of the labor value of water, you really don't care because, it's like, oh, you're not going to be there, sitting there being like, well, these diamonds represent 8,000 hours of labor and that glass of water represents 2 seconds of labor. You're going to say, take my bag of diamonds, give me that glass of water, because otherwise you're going to die, right? So this is the kind of diamond water paradox. Sometimes diamonds are worth a lot, but you can imagine a circumstance where you would trade, an enormous number of diamonds for an amount of water that would keep you alive, regardless of, there's water out there somewhere. It exists in infinite supply. You just don't have access to that supply. And you know that a lot of labor went into getting the diamonds and very little into getting the water, but that doesn't really matter to you. So you're going to pay, 10 diamonds for 1 glass of water. So what do the Austrians suggest? The value of something isn't based on something as objective as the amount of time it took to produce it or its scarcity. What it's based on is individuals making subjective judgments about the value of something. Right, so you in the desert needing that glass of water, you're going to make a subjective, a completely subjective valuation that glass of water is worth a bag of diamonds, right? Because you're more interested in staying alive through drinking that glass of water than potentially getting, being a dead person with a bag of diamonds. So we make subjective decisions about the value of something all the time, right? So this is the Austrian kind of innovation. And this is what's sometimes referred to as the marginal revolution in economics. Because even though it seems really straightforward, until people like Menger suggested it, people had never really thought about economics this way. The level of value of an item is the gap or margin, right? That's why it's called the marginal revolution. The gap or margin that an individual assigns to how much more valuable it would be to have one or more of those items in those circumstances. So what can we say about value? And right, change the circumstances. If you're sitting on the couch in your house with your bag of diamonds, and someone says, I'll trade you that bag of diamonds for this cup of water, you're going to say, that's ridiculous. I can walk to the sink and get as many glasses of water as I want. But if you're in the desert and that person has the only glass of water that you know of in the vicinity, your subjective valuation of that water changes fundamentally, right? So value, when we think of value, things don't have a set value based on labor. It's subjective, right? The value of everything, according to the Austrians, including labor, is inherently subjective, right? It depends on the place, time, the circumstances, what the possibilities are of you getting it from somewhere else. All of these things establish the value, right? So there is, for the Austrians, no set value in labor, right? There's no labor theory of value because your labor might end up being worthless, right, to someone, right? They might not actually think your labor is worth anything, right? And so, just like the value of that cup of water is different in different circumstances, for the Austrians, the value of your labor is different in different circumstances as well. So why is an iPhone worth a lot of money, right? As opposed to, an equally okay phone, right? Like the one I have. Why is an iPhone 17 Pro Max worth, almost $2,000, where this one, I think I paid $400 for it? Well, it's entirely in subjective valuations, right? It's not that the iPhone took 10 hours more to make, right? They probably took roughly the same amount of time to make in whatever Foxconn factory in China they were probably both produced in. it's entirely in the subjective value that people assign to it. Again, even though there's an infinite supply of both, I could go onto the Google store and order like 1,000 of these, and they'd be, if I had enough money on my credit card, which I clearly don't. I'm only a poor professor after all. Or, I could order 1,000 iPhones. There's really no scarcity problem with either. So their value is not in their scarcity. Their value is in what you assign to them. And if you stop, if you stop buying iPhones, if everybody was like, screw it, iPhones suck, we're not buying any more iPhones, the price of iPhones would come down, right? Apple would start to put them on sale, right? And that's what a sale is in a lot of cases. It's a reflection in some way that the marginal value that people are assigning to a product has declined, right? Or that whatever price has been set is set incorrectly, and they're adjusting it to try and find what the correct margin is. And it's the same for labor. The value of labor in a market will go up and down based on, supply, demand, on needs, and what employers think that labor is worth, right? Rather than some objective sense of value. Okay. So, yeah, even if we dispense with the labor theory of value, which I think there's a really strong case, based on the critiques of the Austrian, we dispose of labor theory of value based on Austrian economics, and I think it makes sense. It doesn't necessarily explain why you shouldn't pay workers all the surplus value created by their labor, right? Why the employees of the Foxconn factory or the diamond mine shouldn't get all of the value of that particular thing that they're producing. Marx would still ask, and Marxists will still ask, why profit is acceptable. So, what do Austrians say? The question is flawed, right? That question is flawed because it makes the assumption that workers aren't being fairly compensated for their capacity to labor. And they think, ultimately, that's flawed. Okay, Ludwig von Mises, right, one of the Austrians. Okay, so some of the counter arguments for this is, who gave that worker a job, right? Who gave the worker a job? Well, it was some capitalist, right? Some member of the bourgeoisie who built a factory, who is paying that person, and who's taking risks, right? And this is one of the Austrian critiques, is like, okay, you're a worker at the diamond mine or in the iPhone factory. And what happens to you if that doesn't work out, right? If that factory closes because everybody stops buying iPhones or there's no market for the diamonds? Well, it sucks. You lose your job, you get laid off. But really, your risk is minimal, right? Your risk is you spent some time working there. The capitalist, right, the person who built the factory, who borrowed money from a bank, who built the factory, who's created this enterprise, right, who bought all the diamond mining equipment and the land rights and all of that stuff, they stand to lose a lot more, right? The owners can lose a ton more than the workers if the enterprise doesn't work out, right? So, they add a lot of value to the project as well. It's just not in their labor. Most of the value that, say, an owner adds is in risk. It's taking the risks of losing a whole bunch of capital, right, of being in debt, of going bankrupt, that the workers fundamentally never have to take on. All they take on is losing some hours of their lives, right? So, profit, then, for the Austrians, is the just wage capitalists take based on the greater risk, right? You're taking less risk, you get less reward. You take more risk, you get more reward. Okay, other critiques that Marxists make of kind of Austrian economics, things like, well, what about, those not running companies, right? But making profit, i.e. investors, right? The investors or the shareholders, right? And this is a critique a lot of times of what's called shareholder capitalism. Kind of what we have now. I own one share of Apple, by the way, which is always fun at every annual board meeting because I get to vote based on my one share, and which I think is absolutely hilarious because my vote doesn't matter because, you know, there's like millions of shares of Apple, but I always like to log in right at the end to vote on stuff because it's super fun. It's just like, I'm going to vote anti everything on the board of Apple. No one cares. I own one share. Okay, so shareholder capitalism, right? This is the idea, right, that a lot of investment comes from people who buy shares in companies, and this is broadly what we have. And Marxists will critique it. Okay, like, all right, this guy's taking risks, right? The owner is taking risks. The investors, you know, they're not taking nearly as much risk. So why then do we have, say, the investors in companies reaping these huge rewards as well? And the Austrian answer to this is, again, investors are fairly compensated. Because what they've done, right? And here's a kind of a basic economic principle. So, you know, hopefully you're all putting money into RRSPs and other things as soon as you can, right? You know, start investing, start putting money away as soon as you can, even if it's a little bit. Trust me, it adds up over time. And if you forgo it, it doesn't. Now, you know, you're in university. You probably don't have a lot of money, right? So let's say that you start investing in RRSPs, right? You start putting money into an RRSP in a mutual fund. What you've done, essentially, according to the Austrian school, is that you've foregone other opportunities to enjoy your money, right? Or to do other things with your money. So let's say you put $100 into your RRSP every month, right? That $100 would buy shockingly little in today's economy. But, you know, maybe you could eat out twice or 3 times on that money, you know, optimistically, if you budget really well. You could, you know, go to the movies. You could, you know, I don't know, buy a tank of gasoline or whatever it happens to be. You're foregoing other opportunities to use that money for future returns, right? And in order, according to the Austrians, to help make others more productive. So you're going to invest, you know, in a mutual fund, and they're going to invest in Apple, and they're going to invest in, I don't know, like an industrial equipment maker or whatever. You know, there's lots of places that your money goes, and all of that potentially allows this factory worker, right? We're going to call him Joe, to actually get a job, right? You invested, and lots of other people invested, and you've foregone the opportunity to use that money. You're delaying your gratification. And what's the outcome is Joe gets to work in our factory, right? That's my factory. It's super good. There's smoke coming out. I'm a very good artist, as you can tell, right? So you didn't get to use your $100, but Joe gets to work and earn a living wage. And so when it comes time to pay it out, you know, Joe gets X amount of money. And you get a dividend, and eventually your shares increase in value as a recompense for that delay, in your self-gratification, and your ability, you know, your enabling of Joe and hundreds of other Joes to have that job. So, you know, all of these things, you know, Joe doesn't really deserve, in kind of Austrian economics, all of that money that comes from the product, because you made it possible for Joe, you know, so that the factory owner and you, the investor, made it possible for Joe to even have a job, and you too should get some kind of return on investment. So this critique of Marxism broadly gets picked up by neoliberal economics, right? So it's not like I said, liberal economics and kind of classical Adam Smith economics has very much a labor theory of value, just like Marxism. Neoliberal economics, so stuff like Chicago School, Milton Friedman economics, broadly picks up this same kind of view from the Austrians. Okay, hopefully that all makes sense. I must have a question slide. No one has questions. Either you're all super bored, or I have explained this super well and there are no questions. Okay, that's fine. All good. I'm happy with this. So, one other thing that I want to talk about, I think, for the Austrians, and then we'll talk about, you know, Durkheim and go back to some more classical sociological theories, and hopefully, you know, either wrap up concepts and theories today or early on Monday. Okay. So Hayek, Friedrich Hayek. So he's probably the last of the really great Austrian economists. He wins a Nobel Prize in economics at one point. This is one of everybody's favorite quotes from Hayek. You know, if socialists understood economics, they wouldn't be socialists. I think I know a few socialists who would dispute that, but whatever. So Hayek, what does he talk about? The importance of prices and wages as means of communication. And this is, I think, an interesting thing that that the Austrians kind of talk about in terms of how prices and wages get set. And they say that, you know, there's a lot, okay, this might take me a second to explain. One of the big critiques of kind of communism and centrally planned economies from, and this will go for things like, and we'll talk about Keynesianism a few slides from now, because it's another school of economics, but Keynesian economics as well, from the Austrians is that a lot of schools of economics, you know, Marxist, Keynesian, assume that what you can do is sort of, you know, plan an economy, right? That there can be technocrats, you know, really smart people, economists. Again, if you want to see someone that in kind of very contemporary terms that has this view, go read Mark Carney's book, right? I have a lot of critiques of Mark Carney. Not my favorite person. Mark Carney's book is loaded with this exact kind of thinking that really smart people should be able to plan an economy, right? They should be able to set prices, wages, you know, control, you know, pull the levers of the economy in such ways as to ensure a smooth operation. Why? Because they're so smart, okay? And absolutely, like lots of people like this. Every central banker in the world thinks this, right? A lot of economists think this. I think every government kind of thinks that, you know, the Minister of Finance is going to be able to manage economics because they're really smart, right? So we would say Marxists and Keynesians, you know, think that you can plan the economy, and Keynes, right? That you can intervene in the economy and that you can kind of control how the economy works. Now, the Austrian critique of this is, how to put this? So, if you take the aggregate of individuals, right? The aggregate of individuals, each making their own economic decisions, right? Whether they're workers or business owners or whatever, they have a lot more information, right, about the economy than Mark Carney or any other kind of any other person who thinks they're really smart and wants to plan the economy is ever going to have, right? Why? Well, because I know my life, right? You know your life. I know my life. I know what I need. I know what I want, what my plans are, you know, what my hopes, dreams, aspirations are, what I want to buy, what I see value in, right? Economically, I know what those things are, you know, and then you know that for yourself. And when we all kind of know our own lives, that actually generates a lot of information. All of us acting in our own self-interest based on our own motivations has a lot more information than any central banker could ever have, right? Because we know how we want to run our lives, what we can afford, what we think the fair value of things are, you know, our own economic situations, how stable we think our jobs are, all of that. We know way more, you know, as an aggregate than any single person or group of people at the top of an economy could ever know, right? And this is why markets tend to work really well, right? Because it's a bunch of people making decisions for themselves that all kind of move things in unison. And if they don't think a product is valuable anymore, that product disappears in favor of a product that they think is much more valuable. As opposed to, say, somewhere like the Soviet Union, where the central authorities would be like, hey, we think that this is the product that everyone should have, right? We think a car should be the Lada and the Moskva and all these other terrible cars that were produced in Eastern Europe, and we think they should be produced in these amounts. versus like, hey, I'm going to go to the dealership and buy these cars, and car companies are going to respond and all that. They're going to say, okay, right now we're not going to make any small cars anymore because everybody's driving SUVs. Whereas in a planned system, be like, no, small car more efficient. We'll make even people not want. I don't know why I did that accent, but it was fun. Okay. So there's a lot of information in the economy that no single person or group can absorb, right? And prices and wages tell us a whole lot without having to explicitly communicate, right? So Hayek's example is the tin market, right? So he has this example, the market for the metal tin, right? And he basically says, if the price of tin goes up, everybody's going to know that there's probably a shortage in the supply. And so they will adjust their value, right? It's like, okay, tin is going up. There must be a change in the supply. So we're going to raise the prices, right? Charge people more. And then people are going to be like, oh man, tin's going up. Well, maybe I should start making things out of aluminum instead because aluminum's cheaper, right? Without anybody having to communicate information, a lot of that just gets communicated through prices. And the same thing, right? If you are a worker, and you're getting your wage, but then you start to hear from other people working other places like, hey, I'm making $45 an hour. And you're like, man, I'm only making 35. Without, the government having to set anything, you're probably going to quit your job and move to a place where wages are higher or demand a raise from your boss. And that boss is then going to have to either lose you or pay you a higher wage, right? So there's a lot of information that just happens in the economy, and the economies kind of naturally adjust based on aggregate information. Okay, and this only works, Hayek thinks, in a system of private property and free exchange. So one of the things that people really often don't like about Austrian economics is that Austrian economics is fundamentally opposed to a minimum wage. Unless that minimum wage is zero, right? Because the Austrians are going to be like, anything that you do to put in a minimum wage, to say like, this clerk at the grocery store that scans your food and puts it in a bag that you brought yourself or forgot in your car, so you then had to buy another bag because, I'll still never get used to the no plastic grocery bags. But anything you do to establish a minimum wage artificially is going to raise wages, right? It's artificially going to skew the whole wage structure and kind of mess the whole thing up, right? And also, might have people just stay in minimum wage jobs because instead of responding to market incentives, they're just going to stay in a minimum wage job because it's enough for them to live on, rather than seeking to increase their skills and their value in the economy. Okay, I don't know if I've over-explained Austrian economics, but I think that's probably enough. Okay, so kind of in sum for Austrian economics, right? And in terms of labor value. Labor value is marginal, right? It exists only in context. Your labor doesn't have a fixed value, and it's certainly not the value of whatever extra value is created in a product. It is kind of whatever the market sets and whatever you can get based on particular circumstances. And workers don't necessarily deserve all of the benefit of their labor because other people have had inputs in that as well. The owner has put risk, the investor has foregone opportunities in order to give you that job. Okay. And the system is basically self-regulating. Okay. So how am I doing for time? Oh, wow, that went quick. I love Austrian economics. It's super fun to talk about, and I lost track of time entirely. Okay, so Durkheim. Durkheim's so we're back to sociologists, right? So Durkheim is very much a sociologist, not an economist. So when he talks about kind of work and labor, a couple of the things that he thinks are interesting to talk about. One, he has what's called a consensus view, right? So he thinks, in terms of how people build consensus in society, how societies kind of smoothly function by people getting along. So rather than a conflict view like in Marxism. And he thinks, right, workers and owners work together, right? They build a consensus on things like wages. Okay. So he thinks, that a division of labor, right, where Marx and to a lesser extent Adam Smith view the division of labor as something that inherently could be alienating to workers. Durkheim doesn't have that view. Durkheim tends to think that a division of labor has always existed in human societies, and it's actually one of the things that makes civilization possible, right? You need a division of labor. It creates an interdependence amongst members of a society, so it makes people depend on each other, and it makes civilized life possible. Why? Well, because you're never going to be able to have one person who does everything, right? And so specialization in terms of tasks is going to happen, right? Even back in medieval times, right, prior to capitalism, there was a baker, a cobbler, a blacksmith, people who were specialized and did special tasks. All he thinks is that under kind of the factory system, that's accelerated and those tasks have gotten smaller and smaller. Now, he does have concerns about the excessive division of labor under capitalism, right? Because kind of like Marx and Adam Smith to an extent, he sees the possibility that under a factory system, you're going to get so specialized, right? Instead of making a shoe, you're just going to bolt the rivets onto that shoe. And he thinks, this can lead to a bunch of things, right? You lose that interdependence, right? Because suddenly you're working in a factory, you don't see how you're connected to other people or even how your labor matters, right? Imagine all day long in a factory just bolting rivets onto a shoe, right? After a while, you would just not even see where you're part of, what your role in society was, right? Whereas the baker could be like, man, I make the bread that feeds the village. Or the butcher's like, I butcher the animals that people then cook to feed themselves. Those people could see, and the blacksmith, I make the horseshoes that people use on their horses, which they use to plow the field. Everybody there could see their value in the community. Under an excessive division of labor, you start to lose that. And the result for Durkheim is what he calls anomie. So anomie is one of Durkheim's big terms. And anomie is this term that basically means you've been unmoored from social values, norms, and you don't know what your place in society is anymore. Now, for Durkheim, this is a big problem because if you're in the state of anomie, you stop feeling like you're part of the society, you probably get depressed, and you start to float, right? Outside of social context, you start to kind of float and become disconnected from other social bonds, leading to a lot of unhappiness, right? Okay. Now, again, Durkheim's principally writing, in the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, and he thought, that basically all of this would get solved naturally. He thought that, industrialization was a huge disruption in the life of the world. But what would happen eventually is that institutions would grow and come into place that would sort out a lot of these problems, right? So you'd end up getting cooperation amongst employers, unions, and workers to get past these growing pains and come out of them with a society that really works. Okay. Oops, I drank from the wrong part of my cup. Okay, so just a Durkheim quote. I won't read it. You can read it yourself. But, basically the idea, if a society lacks social unity, that is going to have to be reestablished in some way or it's all going to fall apart. Okay. Yeah, Durkheim at his core, right, he's what's called a functionalist, but he's very concerned with the question of what holds society together, right? What keeps everything functioning smoothly. And again, this kind of period of industrialization, Durkheim sees as one where older bonds, right, of common language, of religion, of regional culture, all start to break down, right? Industrialization is a transformation of the world. And as, people move out of the villages of the medieval period and off the farms, where, they all shared a common language, a regional culture, and a religion, the whole world starts to realign. Now, Durkheim doesn't necessarily think this is a bad thing, just that it's going to generate a lot of social problems that are going to have to be sorted out. Because the collective consciousness, which is made up of, all of the norms, beliefs, and values of a society, starts to break down, right? And so a lot of things that allowed people to cooperate, right, to override their own egoism, breaks down as well. And until new institutions come that bind people together, and for Durkheim, one of the big ones that was going to do this, he thought, was the nation, right? The nation state and national identity. But until those things kind of supplant, culture, religion, common language, ultimately things were going to get fairly dicey. And when you lose this kind of collective set of values, collective consciousness, what he suggested was people would revert to kind of more animalistic and tribal sort of ways of being. Do you have time for one more? Okay, this is only 1 minute. Let's leave it here. I'll pick up on society. We just have a few more slides. Okay, thank you. We'll see you on Monday. Hopefully you learned something about Austrian economics and the way that it answers some critiques from Marx and liberal economics as well. And I think it's fun and interesting. And next time you have a glass of water, just think how many diamonds you would pay for it in the desert. All right, we'll see you on Monday.